What is up, everybody? Jake, your resident content cowboy here. Yeehaw. It's Monday. On Mondays, we do tier lists, and on Wednesdays, we wear pink.
On Wednesdays, we wear pink.
I'm going to try to rank a lot of the big cards and big decks that you will see in Pokemon TCG Pocket. As always, the game is evolving, just like a Pokemon, and something that you think maybe right at the start changes as you start to see players adapt to what is thrown at them. This is going to be a general tier list, but also kind of what you're seeing in some of the tournaments out there. I think the amazing thing about Pocket right now, I'm going to make this a little bigger. Whoop. I think the amazing thing about Pocket right now is that you don't have a reason to hardcore play meta picks. So if something that I particularly think is low tier is one of your favorite decks, it really does not matter, especially if you're playing it at a high level and you're enjoying what you're doing, right? There is not a ranked mode in the game that you have to grind with only 2 decks, kind of thank goodness. So I do think a lot of this is for fun, but also a look at kind of what the game is evolving into from when we first had our launch and our soft launch, right? So I'm going to try to go through basically every kind of big deck that you can think of that is on this tier list. If I miss some, I'm sorry about that. As always, please let me know what you agree with or disagree with in the comments. I love to hear it. Just be cool to each other. Let's take a look at our tiers. We have our God tier. We're only going to have one deck in our God tier. We're not friggin' Norse around here. We have our S tier. These are the best decks in the game. Our A tier, extremely good. Beats out a lot of things in the meta. For our B tier, ugh, still got the B tier. B tier decks are fine. C tier, a little underwhelming. And then D tier, things that I really don't love in the game. I mean, we'll probably nickname that tier at some point. We did for Pokemon Unite. It was called the Decidueye Memorial tier. I don't know what we would call it here for Pocket right now. But let's start taking a look at some of these decks. Where do we want to start? We could start bottom up, but that might be a little tricky too. Maybe we'll just start with some staples and we'll bounce around a little bit. You know what? This will be fun. Let's start with Dragonite. I'm just going to start moving some of them up here. Dragonite, Dragonite, Dragonite. And am I missing a Dragonite? Okay, I think I've got all the Dragonites here, hopefully. So let's take a look at some of the common Dragonites. There's got to be like a Dragonite Snorlax or something, right? I feel like that's a very common one. It's just so confusing looking at there it is. It's so confusing looking at these cards with like the split because I can't tell which card I'm looking at. So Dragonite, we have 4 variations of Dragonite that you'll see. I do think there are some others that work. I actually think Dragonite Lapras is okay. You can play Dragonite with a few water types that work pretty well, a few lightning types that work well also, but this is a lot of what you see. Dragonite Frostmoth, you've got that control from Frostmoth early. Dragonite Hypno, using Hypno as a wall and also putting people to sleep, giving yourself more time to build. Wheezing Dragonite, probably the most common that you see. It's really strong and you don't need any energy for Wheezing. And then we have Snorlax Dragonite, that big wall for Dragonite, so you set up behind it. I think there are a lot of decent options here. In general, I don't think a single Dragonite deck for me is higher than C tier. I would put them all in C tier, and the only reason for that is, well, we almost could have called it the Dragonite tier, huh? Dang it, if Dragonite was worse, that D tier would have been our Dragonite tier, wouldn't it have been? The only reason I think Dragonite sits here is just because of the inconsistency with energy. There are enough games, not a ton, but there are enough games where you will literally never pull that specific energy you need and you won't be able to use the deck at all. Because of that inconsistency, I don't think it can ever really rise much higher than like C, maybe B tier, right? If there was a trainer card, or if they change the way energy works where it's always alternating, or you even get to pick, if you got to pick the energy that was coming out, that would like rock the meta with so many different decks you could play. But the way energy works right now, I just think it's unreliable. Out of all of these decks, I would say Dragonite Wheezing is probably the best. I don't love Snorlax as a card personally. It's just really hard to get out. And against most decks that want to set up, like, they're happy with letting you wall with Snorlax, having no way to get that Pokemon out, and then eventually when you want to start to bring things in, you could Sabrina them in or set up Charizard on your side. That's like probably my least favorite. I gotta be honest, I've really not messed around with the Hypno variation of this much, but I mostly play a water deck with Dragonite or Wheezing, and I think they're all pretty good, but not amazing because of the energy. All right, let's see. What's next here? Let's move on. You know what? We talked a little bit about Weezing. Let's bring out some of our Weezing decks here, which there could be a lot. We've got Weezing Wiggly, Weezing Arbok, Weezing Muck. Let's see if they have any others that are set here. The thing about them is, like, you actually compare Weezing with so many different things, but these are some of the more common ones that you'll see. What do they have Gengar with? Hypno Guardy. That makes sense. Okay, cool. All the Weezing decks, I think, are really solid. I think Muck is the worst of the group. I'd put Muck into the C tier. I'd put Wiggly EX probably in the B tier, and I'd put Arbok Weezing in our A tier. I actually really like Wiggly EX Weezing. The only issue with it is I think Wiggly at times, like Jiggly is an annoying card. It takes 2 energy. Promo Jiggly might make that much better. I think it plays decently well into a lot of the meta. 140 HP, which is disappointing for Mewtwo, right, on the Wigglytuff, but a nice flip on sleep, and that's not too bad. And then you have Arbok Weezing. Arbok Weezing has great control. I really like it. I really like how much you can mess with your opponents when you're running a deck like this. And it's dark type all the way through. You are definitely using that dark type energy. Same thing with our Weezing Wiggly deck, by the way, which is really cool for that extra damage. But really nice into Mewtwo, and it works well into a lot of different decks. You know, there are a lot of things that don't want to let you lock them down, and Arbok Weezing is able to do that, which I think is really cool. So that goes into the A tier for me. All right, let's move on. We can do some of our psychic types here. We got a lot of them here too. Oh, you know what? No, we've got an Arbok deck. I'm gonna bring that up, and then I'm gonna bring up a couple more dark decks here. So Nido, and Wiggly Golurk. I'll talk about that here in a minute, and then we'll move on to some of our psychic types. Okay. Our Arbok Pidgeot, I think, is okay. I think it's actually a little overrated. I would put it down here in the C tier. These are like situational decks that I think can work pretty well, but I think when it feels like to me when Pidgeot Arbok is working well, it's also when your opponent is drawing bad. Because I think a deck drawing decently well into Pidgeot Arbok is not too stressed out about what it's bringing. Wigglytuff Golurk, I've never heard of it. I've never seen this deck. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You've got a lot of energy needed for Golurk and a lot of energy needed for Wiggly. I don't know what you'd run with this. I haven't even heard of this deck. I'm putting it, you know what? We need a new tier. This is the I'm sorry, what tier? I have not heard of this. I've got to try it because honestly, maybe I'm being a huge hater on this deck right now, but I've never heard of Wigglytuff Golurk. If I'm missing out on one of the best decks in the game, I apologize. It sounds crazy, but fair enough. Okay. Nidoking, Nidoqueen, unfortunately, I think is one of the worst position decks in the game. It needs a supporter. If the Nidos get a supporter, I think something cool could happen. I just put out a video on a Nido deck the other day. I really like the idea behind it, but my goodness, you're telling me that I need to get 3 stage 2 Pokemon online before this deck is actually doing so, like, and they don't even do that much damage as they're like attacking on curve or anything. Like, please something better. I think it's one of the most unfortunate decks in the game because it's really cool and everybody likes it, and it's just rough, really rough. Okay. Moving on to some of our psychics here. Let's pull up Gengar, Mewtwo, Alakazam. We got any more of them right here that they're showing us? No, not really, huh? Okay, let's talk Gengar. I think Gengar is cool and also one of the more underwhelming EXs. It feels like it just doesn't do enough damage sometimes, and it doesn't have a good way to get enough energy on it. It feels like Gengar EX with Guardy is just such an inferior version of it compared to Mewtwo. I think the highest I could put that is probably C. Gengar Hypno is probably the same way. Like, you'll have some okay games with it, and unfortunately, a lot like our Nidos, like, it just takes a long time to get online. It doesn't seem to do enough. It's a stage 2 that once it's out there is doing 100 damage. It's just a little underwhelming. Then we have Mewtwo EX Gardevoir, which I think is our first S tier that I'm going to put on our list. I don't think you're surprised at all to hear that. Mewtwo is crazy good, one of the best decks in the game. It's easy to set up. Yes, you do need to get guard, right? You do need to get one Pokemon to stage 2. But the nice thing is, compared to some of the other decks that need like a stage 2 to do a ton of damage, this actually has all of its damage through its basic. So even if you're not getting guard that fast, you're still powering up Mewtwo that does pretty good damage into the enemy team. Also, now that you're seeing Mewtwo played more with baby Mewtwo, I think this deck is truly one of the best ones out there. Alakazam to me is fine. I don't think I can put it too much higher than C. I think Alakazam, here's the tough thing about it is there are certain decks you run into with Alakazam that I think you're having a really fun time because you're kind of like you one-shot Dragonite, which is really cool, right? But I do think it, especially with Gardevoir, it feels a lot like Mewtwo. With Hypno, I think it feels kind of more refreshing. And then there is a cool thing, like Alakazam Greninja is not something I've messed around with too much. That sounds like a fun idea. But I do think all of those decks are fine. And our C tier, like these decks are playable and you win with them, but they just feel fine to me. And I think Alakazam in general is fine. If you were always running into decks with like Blastoise fully powered up, with Charizard fully powered up. Part of the problem is too, after those cards attack, they lose energy that's on them. So when you get Alakazam out, unless they have full energy, you're doing less damage to them. It's just kind of like, it feels like it's set up to beat Mewtwo and beat Char, but it actually doesn't. It does better into Blastoise or Venusaur, which are not huge threats. Venu more than Blastoise, right? Okay, speaking of Venusaur, let's talk about it. We've got Venusaur. Okay. I think one of these decks is much better than the others, and I would say that's Venusaur EX and Executor EX. I actually think Executor EX is crazy good. It's a really good card. You can often run this with regular Executors in your deck too. The nice thing about it is it's a 1 energy, and the rest of the time you can spend that energy like powering up Venusaur. Erica's really good for these bulky grass-type Pokemon also. I think it's pretty solid. I think Lilligant Venusaur to me is a little closer to B. That might even be a little high for it. It can be it's one of those decks, like drawing bad on this is chaotically bad, it feels like. But if you get your Lilligant set up and then you're attacking while at this, like you're doing 50 damage and at the same time you're powering your bench, I think it's a really solid combination. I feel like that's pretty B. I think Venusaur Caterpie is not very good. It's okay. I think it's like, I think D is maybe a little too harsh. It's probably C. I'm sorry, D tier, but I think, oh, I know how we're naming this. It is the knee, and there's the D in there. The Nido tier. Yeah, I think that's what's just happened there. Sorry, Nido King deck. But I do think this is like probably the most underwhelming way to play Venusaur. While it's still a really good card, and once you get a powered up Venusaur out there, it's hard for your opponents to stop. The cool thing about Caterpie is you are searching your deck for grass Pokemon, so it's easier to get the evolution you need for that Venusaur. I just think the aggression you get out of Executor, and same thing a little bit with Lilligant, plus powering it up on the bench with energy, I think both of those are a little stronger. So if I'm running Venusaur, I'm running it in this order. I'm going Venusaur Executor, then Venusaur Lilligant, then Venusaur Caterpie. Cool. We can do some of our ground decks here. We've got Brock Golem. We've got Marowak Dugtrio, Marowak Machamp. Do they have in here our Primeape decks? I guess they don't yet, huh? This tier list needs some Primeape love. Does it even have Primeape? Oh, it kind of has Primeape. It just doesn't have it set up as a deck, right? All right, I'm going to bring Primeape up here, which I think is a pretty solid deck right now. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's talk about these. Golem, better than people think, but yes, still a bit underwhelming. I actually think Golem is honestly probably better than a lot of the C tier right here, Golem Onyx. And there are a few different ways you can build this. I think Brock, it's a guaranteed 1 energy. And you can play Golem in a lot of cool ways because of it. Like you can play a Wheezing Golem or something like that where you just have dark energy. And the only time you put energy on Golem is once because it needs one fighting energy. You put one energy on it with Brock. The rest of it can just be dark energy powering it up. Onyx is different. It's all fighting energy. So you're running Onyx in a different way. You would not run a strategy like that. But I actually think both of these are okay. One nice thing is Golem is a one hit on Mewtwo. Like it'll take Mewtwo in one hit. It'll take with Giovanni, it takes a few things. It takes like Dragonite on one hit. But in general, I think it's pretty solid. And the nice thing about it is it's, not an EX Pokemon, right? Marowak. I think Marowak is pretty good. There's a few versions of Marowak. I guess Marowak Sandslash is not on here. The strongest is probably Marowak Machamp right now. Probably, but also I think Machamp Primeape's pretty good. I'm going to put both of our Marowaks, I'm going to put them in our B tier right here. The fact is, if you're flipping good, things are going pretty well for you. And if you're not, things are not going so well. The nice thing about Machamp, and maybe Machamp should just be on its own, like having a separate conversation. Actually, Machop, Machoke, Machamp, all being able to attack for the energy that they are, like their stage. So you've got a basic for 1 energy, a stage 1 for 2, and a stage 3, and a stage 2 for 3. I think that's actually pretty solid, and it plays decently well into things like Pikachu and some of the water decks. Marowak, Doug Trio is cheesy but quite fun. Again, I probably could put this C just because you're flipping coins, but I actually think you like 2 energy to possibly KO Mewtwo in a single hit. It's pretty dang solid. Let's see. We've got Primeape. I haven't put Primeape down. I actually think Primeape's insanely good. You might get maybe in tournament play, it's probably closer to our B tier. I think Primeape is a really, really solid card, but you'd probably pair it with some of these other decks. So I guess right now I'm just talking about Primeape generally. I think it's quite good. You've got kind of the Primeape Zubat deck that you see out there. You've run Primeape with things like Machamp. You could run Primeape with Marowak. There are a few different ways to run it, right? You've got your Marowak in case you're running into Psychics, or you've got Primeape in case you're running into like lightning types and things like that. So I actually think it's pretty good. If you were to argue with me and tell me it should be down in the B tier, I could see what you're saying, but I think Primeape's actually really, really, really solid. We have another one here that I want to put up. I guess this would be the equivalent of it, right? Which would be Ninetales, Rapidash. To me, this deck is talking about the Blaine deck. It's Ninetales, Rapidash with Blaine, which I think is a really, really solid no EX deck. It's kind of right up there with Primeape for me. Again, maybe both of these go down 1, but the cool thing about our A tier right now is I actually have like 3 non-EX decks in it, and I think they're all really solid, and they play well into the meta. Okay, let's talk about some of our fire Pokemon now that we're bringing them up here. Boop, 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 boop. Fire Pokemon seem to be kind of in flux right now, which is really interesting. At the start of the game, I thought they were pretty dang underwhelming, right? I don't even know what this Arcanine Blaine really is. I don't, or Charizard Blaine. I don't know. I wouldn't really run Charizard Blaine, and I don't see it that much. So Moltres sent to Scorch. I think Moltres would be with Arcanine as well. I guess I'm just gonna put this down. I don't really see much Arcanine Blaine. I'm just gonna talk about Arcanine. So I think Charizard is at worst probably B. And I think Arcanine I'm moving up to B tier as well. And I think Scorch is probably a little closer to C. Char is always kind of in the conversation right there with Pikachu and Mewtwo, but it does feel like the least consistent of the 3. Arcanine actually gaining a lot of popularity recently because I think people recognize like, oh, this thing can one-shot Pikachu, and it's ready like without as much setup as Char. In some ways, I kind of think it's better than Char. And then in other ways, Charizard still is a one-hitter KO, right? Like Arcanine does not KO Mewtwo in 1 hit, but it would get it in 2. And the nice thing is it's only a stage 1. You don't need to look for a stage 2, and it's 1 less energy, and you don't discard any energy. So Arcanine gets set up pretty dang fast. Like the 2 compared to each other, I would say it's maybe a little better than Char right now, but I have seen some decks where they're kind of like being played together. Scorch to me feels like I don't think it's awful, but I also just feel like in some ways it's just sort of worse Arcanine or worse Char. It's like you're splitting between them. However, it's not an EX, which I do think is pretty cool. Moving on to some of our other cards right here. We've gone through a lot of our... I think that's all of our fire Pokemon that we'd be talking about, right? Again, I don't know Blaine Arcanine too much or Blaine Char too much. Let's start talking about... We can do water here. Start bringing them up. Blastoise, Starmie, Articuno. Can you tell that Starmie's good? With how many water decks Starmie works in? Starmie's like the one water Pokemon that doesn't need so much dang energy, and that's why it's so good. Also, it has no retreat cost, and I love that card more than anything. Blastoise. Blastoise is weird. I don't know about Blastoise Lapras. I've actually seen some Blastoise decks. In fact, I'm just going to move this down and talk about Blastoise in general. I think Blastoise might be a little slept on right now. I think like we might be seeing a little bit of a come up for Blastoise, which I think would be really cool. So Blastoise's big problem is that it requires a lot of energy, and water does not have a reliable way to charge up energy. But I know that some people have been playing around with Blastoise and using things, I think like Baby Mewtwo, to kind of tank for it while you set up Blastoise. Then once it gets set up, it can really start sweeping and has a lot of energy. So I'm going to cautiously say that Blastoise is, I'm going to put it C, but I think we might actually be like heading towards a little Blastoise reconnaissance, right? We might see something, although that would mean Blastoise was great at one point, right? I guess this would just be a great moment for Blastoise. It wouldn't be a reconnaissance. So sorry to Matthew McConaughey. Let's move on. Starmie Greninja, I think, is great. I'd put it up into our A tier. Starmie Frostmoth is probably maybe B. Starmie Articuno is probably like really high A. And then Articuno EX, the lowest I could put it is B. Even though I think that card is so dumb. Just 18 Trainers Articuno. You also can play 18 Trainers Lapras, which sometimes I think kind of works better. I think Starmie, what you'll notice with a lot of these decks is Starmie plays well with so many different things. Like you can play Starmie Dragonite and it's not too bad, right? It's like a lot of damage and it only requires 2 energy, and you can Misty from possibly 1 or both of those energies. You've got Starmie Greninja. Greninja needs almost no energy. Starmie needs no energy. This thing is super aggressive. Articuno, really solid wall, and also something that you can power up while you're using a Pokemon like Starmie that has no retreat costs and only 2 energy to attack. Really good. Frostmoth, this one's a little weirder. The thing that I think is weird about this is Starmie Frostmoth, it feels like both of these Pokemon are very similar. So Frostmoth stage 1, Starmie stage 1, both require 2 water energy. It's kind of just whichever one you get out there, but at the same time, sometimes I just want to do the damage, so I think that one's like closer to B for me. Starmies are all really good. I love that card, and I've noticed that Starmies in tournaments seem to kind of get beat a little bit. I think it doesn't have enough HP to play into Mewtwo, and then of course Pika, it's weak to lightning. So I think in a lot of games you run, it works pretty well. And then also it has the added bonus of being a card that can benefit from Misty. And I think that you like all water decks for that reason do have an option to one turn KO their opponents basically, and it's really hard to deal with. And then finally, let's talk about our lightning decks. We have Pikachu Raichu and Pikachu Zapdos. And there are some other variations of this, right? Like you could break it down more and more as to what kind of Pikachu we're talking about here and what other Pokemon they're bringing with it, whether you're talking about Zebstrika, Electrode, Pincurchin. I think there are a lot of options here. For me, I think Pika Zap is probably S, and then Pika Raichu. Honestly, they both might be S. But if I had to pick one, I do think like the standard Pika Zap with a couple of other basics is a little better just because it's a little like slightly more consistent. But I do think both of these decks are extremely good. Pika is amazing. However, Pika has recently kind of started to get dethroned a little bit because you just see so much Mewtwo and so many decks trying to figure out how to take down Pika. Like if you look at a lot of like A tier, this stuff plays pretty well into Pika. Primeape is great into Pikachu. Machamp like rising up through the ranks. Marowak is really good into Pikachu. Arcanine one-hit KOs Pikachu. So there are a lot of decks out there that actually are rising the ranks because they play well into one of the most popular decks out there. And now it is time to pick our God tier Pokemon here, our God tier deck. And previously, I would have said Pikachu, and at times I have said Pikachu, but I do think Mewtwo seems to be edging it out lately. And I'm going to make Mewtwo our God tier deck right here. The reason being, I think, is people figuring out that baby Mewtwo is an amazing wall, giving it time to set up. And ever since they've figured that out, not only can baby Mewtwo, this is non-EX Mewtwo, attack, it also gives it time to find Gardevoir. This deck, I don't know if it feels like this when you're playing, but essentially, once Mewtwo has a Gardevoir on the bench, this is one of the most impossible decks to stop in the game. And I think because of that, it's going to sit into our God tier. However, I do love seeing all the different ways that people are looking to counter this. And I like how the meta shakes up. Like, I feel like whenever we take a look at what happened in some of the big tournaments over the weekend and stuff, we'll see like, oh, Mewtwo and Pika are doing extremely well. But like one of these decks in like A, B, or even C sometimes is like, dude, like we see a Charizard deck running Charizard and Arcanine, and it's doing really well. So I gotta say, that much I love. I also love that with every little bit that enters the game, we have a chance for a meta shakeup. We do have a like mini pack. We don't know exactly how many cards is going to be in it, but we do have sort of a mini set that looks like it's going to be released mid-December. So I can't wait to see how that shakes everything up. I would love to see things like a steel deck. Like, I didn't put Melmetal on here because it's like just kind of, it doesn't do too well into a lot of the meta. If I did though, maybe it would be C. Like, I could see like throwing Melmetal here into the C tier. However, I would love an EX version, right, of something like that. Something to help steel type Pokemon. Steelix would be insanely cool. Trying to see if there's anything else that like actually does decently well, but we haven't talked about much. We haven't talked about Lapras. It's not on this list, but I do think Lapras has like some decent decks. You could slot it into some water decks. It would probably be C tier for me. I'm talking about Lapras EX right now. Other than that, I think we've talked about a lot of the big decks in the meta, but not everything, which I also think is just extremely cool. So there you go, guys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Please let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with in the chat or in the comments. I love you, and I'll see y'all next time. Nerf Mewtwo. Nerf baby Mewtwo. Actually, don't nerf anything. Just give us more cards.